At 9:42 p.m., Daniel Hayes pushed open the front door of the house he had spent 12 years building into a life he believed was stable, quiet and honest. And in that single moment, everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the woman he married collapsed into something he could neither process nor escape, because what he saw inside that living room was not just betrayal. It was a reality so sharp and immediate that it cut through him without warning, leaving behind a silence louder than any argument they had ever had, and neighbors would later say they never heard shouting, never heard chaos, just a stillness that settled over the house like something final had already taken place. And when investigators arrived minutes later, they weren't just looking at a scene, they were stepping into the aftermath of a decision made in seconds but shaped by something much deeper, something that didn't begin that night. Something that had been building in ways no one outside that marriage could fully understand, and what happened next would destroy 3 lives and leave behind a question that still divides those who study the case today, because the man sitting in that interrogation room hours later did not look like someone who had lost control. He looked like someone who had reached a conclusion, and the difference between those two things would become the center of everything that followed. Because what he did next wasn't just revenge, it was something no one expected. And before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To everyone on that quiet street in Ohio, Daniel Hayes and his wife Rebecca Hayes represented something steady, something people recognized and trusted, the kind of couple who waved from the driveway, showed up to neighborhood gatherings, and rarely gave anyone a reason to question what was happening inside their home, because Daniel was known as a disciplined man, someone who followed routine, kept his circle small, and believed deeply in commitment. While Rebecca was the opposite in ways that seemed to complement him, warm, engaging, the kind of person who could hold a conversation with anyone and leave them feeling seen, admired even, and for years that contrast appeared to work until slowly, almost too quietly to notice at first, small changes began to surface, changes that didn't seem alarming on their own but started to form a pattern when looked at closely. Late evenings that turned into later nights, conversations that became shorter, moments of distance that Daniel couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either, and then there was the presence of someone else, a figure who would later become central to the questions investigators were trying to answer, someone whose connection to Rebecca was not immediately clear but impossible to dismiss once uncovered, because what unfolded that night did not exist in isolation. It forced everyone to ask whether this was truly a sudden breaking point or the result of something Daniel had been quietly carrying for far longer than anyone realized. And as detectives began piecing together timelines, messages, and movements, one question kept returning with more weight each time: what exactly happened inside that house at 9:42 p.m., and more importantly, when did this story really begin? Because if that moment wasn't the start, then it meant something else had been building beneath the surface, something hidden in plain sight, waiting for the exact second when everything would come undone. Long before that night at 9:42 p.m., Daniel Hayes lived a life defined by structure, the kind of man who woke up at the same time every morning, followed the same route to work, and believed that consistency was the foundation of everything that mattered, including his marriage, because to him, loyalty was not just expected, it was assumed, something unspoken yet absolute, and those who knew him would often describe him as dependable, quiet, even reserved. A man who didn't express much outward emotion but showed commitment through his actions, through the life he steadily built, through the home he maintained, and through the trust he placed in Rebecca Hayes without question, while Rebecca existed in a different rhythm entirely. She was vibrant, engaging, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention without trying, someone who thrived on connection, on conversation, on the energy of people around her. And for years that difference between them seemed to create balance rather than conflict, with Daniel grounding the relationship and Rebecca bringing it to life. But over time that balance began to shift in subtle ways that were easy to overlook at first: late evenings that became routine, phone calls taken in private, a growing distance that wasn't marked by loud arguments but by silence, by moments where words were replaced with avoidance. And Daniel, being who he was, didn't confront things immediately. He observed, he processed, he waited, believing that whatever was changing would correct itself. But instead the gap widened, and what once felt effortless began to feel strained. Conversations became shorter, eye contact less frequent, and the warmth that once defined their home started to fade into something colder, something uncertain, and while Rebecca continued to move through her social world with ease, Daniel remained in place, watching a life he thought was secure begin to feel unfamiliar. And it is in these quiet shifts, these barely noticeable changes, that the foundation of everything started to weaken, because sometimes the smallest cracks lead to the biggest collapses, and by the time anyone realizes how deep those cracks have become, it is often already too late to repair what has been broken. That night everything changed, not gradually, not in a way that could be explained or softened over time, but in a single sequence of moments that began the second Daniel Hayes turned into his driveway earlier than he was supposed to, a small deviation from routine that would later be examined again and again, because nothing about what followed made sense without it. And as he stepped out of his car, there was already something off, something subtle but immediate. The house was darker than usual, quieter in a way that didn't feel normal, and yet there was a presence there, something he couldn't see yet but could feel, and Daniel, being who he was, didn't rush. He moved forward carefully, methodically, his mind already beginning to connect details he didn't fully understand. The unlocked door, the faint shift of sound from somewhere inside, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a house that is supposed to be empty. And when he stepped across that threshold, he wasn't just entering his home. He was stepping into a moment that would divide his life into before and after, and then he heard it, something unmistakable, something that confirmed what he hadn't yet allowed himself to believe, and in that instant everything became clear in the worst possible way, because betrayal is not just seen. It is felt all at once, sharp and overwhelming, leaving no space for doubt or denial, and what Daniel saw in the seconds that followed was something he could never take back. Something that removed any remaining distance between suspicion and reality, and for a brief moment there was stillness, a pause where everything could have gone differently. But it didn't, because in that moment something inside him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and what happened next would only take minutes, decisions made without hesitation, actions that would later be analyzed from every angle yet never fully understood by those who weren't standing where he stood. And when it was over, the silence returned heavier than before, filled with consequences that could not be undone. But what investigators would later uncover, what they would piece together from timelines, evidence, and Daniel's own account, would change how that entire night was seen, because the question was no longer just about what happened in those minutes, but whether those minutes had been leading somewhere all along. By the time police arrived, the scene inside Daniel Hayes' home told a story, one that seemed straightforward at first glance, a confrontation, a moment that escalated, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed, but almost immediately it became clear that it was not the whole story, because Daniel himself did not behave the way investigators expected. There was no frantic confusion, no attempt to reshape what had happened into something else. Instead there was a stillness to him, a controlled presence that made it difficult to determine whether he was in shock or whether he had already accepted what he had done, and that distinction would become one of the first things detectives focused on, because when he gave his initial statement, the timeline he described appeared simple. He came home early, he discovered Rebecca Hayes with another man, and in the intensity of that moment, everything unraveled. But as officers began comparing his account with what they were hearing from neighbors, small inconsistencies began to emerge. A sound reported earlier than Daniel claimed he had arrived, a car seen in the driveway longer than expected, fragments of time that didn't align as cleanly as they should have, and then there were the details surrounding Rebecca's recent behavior, the late nights, the calls, the growing distance that Daniel had never fully explained but had clearly noticed, all of it raising a question that investigators could not ignore. Whether this was truly a single explosive moment or the result of something Daniel had been aware of long before that night, and as they examined phone records, movement patterns, and the sequence of events leading up to 9:42 p.m., the case began to shift in subtle but significant ways, because each new detail added another layer of uncertainty, another possibility that what happened inside that house was not as sudden as it first appeared, and the deeper they looked, the more difficult it became to separate reaction from intention, because the question was no longer just what happened in those final minutes, but when it truly began, and whether the answer to that question would change everything they thought they understood about Daniel Hayes and the choices he made that night. Then investigators uncovered something unexpected, and it didn't come from a dramatic confession or a single piece of evidence. It came from a pattern, one that had been quietly forming long before that night, hidden in plain sight within phone records, timestamps, and movements that, when placed together, told a very different story about Daniel Hayes, because what they found suggested that this was not the first time he had questioned Rebecca Hayes. Loyalty, in fact, it appeared he had known for weeks. Possibly longer, watching small changes turn into certainty, tracking inconsistencies that confirmed what he had not yet confronted directly. And as those findings were laid out, the timeline he had given began to shift under scrutiny, because his early arrival that night no longer looked accidental. It looked intentional, a decision made with purpose, one that placed him at the center of a moment he may have already anticipated, and this changed everything. Because it forced investigators to reconsider whether what happened inside that house was truly spontaneous or the final step in something Daniel had been preparing himself for. And when this was presented during questioning, the man who had remained composed for so long began to show something different, not panic, not denial, but a quiet acknowledgement that there were parts of the story he had not fully explained, and that silence spoke as loudly as any words could have. Because it suggested awareness, and awareness introduced intent, and intent reshaped the entire case, and as this narrative moved into the courtroom, it brought with it a weight that could be felt beyond the evidence itself, because now it was no longer just about a moment of betrayal. It was about what someone does when they believe that betrayal has already been confirmed, how long they carry it, how it changes their thinking, and whether the line between reaction and decision had already been crossed before that night even began. And in the end, the truth that emerged was far more complicated than anyone had imagined, because it did not offer a simple answer, only a deeper understanding of how everything led to that single irreversible moment. One decision, made in seconds, destroyed everything Daniel Hayes had spent years building, and when the case finally reached its conclusion, it left behind more than just a verdict. It left an emptiness that could be felt in every part of the life he once shared with Rebecca Hayes, a home that now stood silent, stripped of the warmth that once defined it, a place where ordinary routines had been replaced by the weight of what could never be undone. And for those who followed the case closely, the outcome did not bring the kind of closure people expect, because while the court addressed what happened, it could not fully answer why it unfolded the way it did, and that question lingered long after everything else had been decided, because this was never just about a single moment, it was about everything that led to it, every suspicion Daniel carried, every distance that grew between him and Rebecca, every unspoken realization that shaped the way he saw that night before it even began. And when you look at it from that perspective, the line between a sudden reaction and something more deliberate becomes harder to define, because emotions do not exist in isolation. They build, they settle, they change the way decisions are made, often long before those decisions are visible to anyone else. And that is what makes this story stay with people, not just what happened, but the uncertainty around when it truly started, because if it began long before 9:42 p.m., then the moment itself was only the final step in something much larger, and that leaves us with a question that does not have a simple answer. Was this truly a crime driven by what Daniel Hayes saw in that instant, or was it shaped by everything he believed long before he walked through that door? Because sometimes the most dangerous moments are not the loudest or the most obvious, they are the ones that form quietly over time, waiting for the exact second when everything changes. And by the time we recognize them, it is already too late. Now, after hearing everything, from the moment Daniel Hayes walked through that door at 9:42 p.m. to the questions that still surround what really led him there, the story doesn't end with a simple conclusion. It stays with you. It makes you replay the details, the timing, the choices, and the silence in between, because what happened inside that house involving Daniel Hayes and Rebecca Hayes is not just about one night. It's about how easily a life that appears stable can begin to shift without anyone else noticing, and how those shifts can shape decisions in ways that only become clear when it's already too late to change them. So the question now turns to you, looking at everything you've heard, every detail, every possibility. What do you think really happened that night? Was it a moment of overwhelming emotion that Daniel couldn't control? Or was it something more calculated? Something that had been forming long before he stepped into that house? Let me know in the comments, because your perspective might see something others have missed. And if this story left you thinking, questioning, or even unsettled, then the next one will take things even further and stay with you long after it ends. So make sure you don't miss it.